Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Allied forces, led by the United States and Great Britain, battled the Axis powers for control of Europe and North Africa. And during World War II, the United States assumed a leading role in world affairs that continue today, but through Episode 4, The War in Europe. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have two objectives today. By the end of this class today, you should be able to summarize the Allies' plans for winning the war, and you should be able to outline the sequence of events for the war and for the liberation in Europe. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 11. Here I want to talk about how the United States and Britain joined forces in subpoint A. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill from Great Britain arrived at the White House on December 22nd of 1941, he spent the next 3 weeks working out war plans with President Roosevelt and his advisors. Believing that Germany and Italy posed a greater, at least a more immediate threat than Japan did, Churchill convinced Roosevelt to strike first against Hitler before turning their eyes eastward towards Japan. Once the Allies had gained an upper hand in Europe, they could pour more resources then into the Pacific War together. At the end of their meeting, both Churchill and Roosevelt had really a friendship formed between them, and in Churchill's words, a very strong affection, which grew within our years of comradeship. When Churchill reached London, he found a message from the president waiting for him, where Roosevelt wrote, "It is fun to be in the same decade as you. You really were dealing with some of the great leaders of any generation working together." Subpoint B. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler ordered submarine raids against ships along America's east coast. The German aim in the Battle of the Atlantic was to prevent food and war materials from reaching Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Great Britain depended on supplies from the sea. The 3,000-mile-long shipping lanes from North America were really her lifeline of keeping afloat. Hitler knew that if he cut that lifeline, Great Britain would be starved into submission. For a long time, it looked like Hitler might actually succeed in that mission. Unprotected American ships were easy targets for the Germans. In the first 4 months of 1942, the Germans sank 87 ships off the Atlantic shore. 7 months into that year, German wolf packs had destroyed a total of 681 Allied ships into the Atlantic. Something had to be done or the war at sea would be absolutely lost. The Allies responded then by organizing cargo ships into convoys. Convoys were groups of ships who traveled together for mutual protection, as they had done in the First World War also. The convoys were escorted across the Atlantic by destroyers who were equipped with sonar for detecting submarines underwater. They were also accompanied by airplanes who used radar to spot U-boats traveling on the ocean's surface. With this improved tracking, the Allies were able to find and destroy German U-boats faster than Germans could even go build them. In the late spring of 1943, Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the German U-boat offensive, reported that his losses had reached an unbearable height. At the same time, United States ships were being built as fast as the U.S. launched a crash shipbuilding program. By early 1943, 140 Liberty ships were produced each month. Launching all of the Allied ships actually eventually began to outnumber sinkings as more and more ships were taking to the seas. By mid of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. A happy Churchill reported to the House of Commons that June was the best month at sea from every viewpoint that we have known in the whole 46 months of the war. Subpoint C. By the winter of 1943, the Allies began to see victories on land as well as the sea. And the first great turning point became the Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans have been fighting in the Soviet Union since 1941. In November of 1941, the bitter cold had stopped them in their tracks outside the Soviet cities of Moscow and Leningrad. When the spring came, German tanks were ready to roll. In the summer of 1942, Germans took the offensive in the southern part of the Soviet Union. Hitler hoped to capture all the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. He also wanted to cut off Stalingrad, a major industrial center on the Volga River. So the German army confidently approached Stalingrad in August of 1942. The Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe prepared the way by nightly bombing raids over the city of Stalingrad. Nearly every wooden building in the city was set ablaze, and it looked so desperate that Soviet officers in Stalingrad actually recommended blowing up the city's factories and abandoning the city so there wouldn't be anything for Hitler to go take. Stalin, though, furiously ordered them to defend his city. I mean, it was his city, namesake city, and defended it all no matter what the cost was. And for weeks, Germans pressed in on the city of Stalingrad, conquering it really house by house in brutal hand-to-hand combat. By the end of September, they controlled 9/10 of the city, or at least what was left of it. And then the winter set in. The Soviets saw the cold as an opportunity to roll fresh tanks across the frozen landscape and begin their massive counterattack. The Soviet army closed in on Stalingrad, trapping the Germans in the city and then around the city, and then cutting off their supplies. The German situation became hopeless, but now Hitler's orders came in: stay and fight, I won't go back to the Volga. Both leaders, stubborn and bullheaded, insisted on capturing the city. The fight continued as the winter turned Stalingrad into really a frozen wasteland. The German commander surrendered on January 31st of 1943, and 2 days later his starving troops also surrendered. In defending Stalingrad, the Soviets lost a lot of people, 1.1 million soldiers, more than all of America would lose in the entirety of the war. The Russians lost in one battle. Despite the staggering death toll, the Soviet Union marked a turning point in the war. From that point on, the Soviet army began moving westwards towards Germany. Subpoint D. While the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Stalin pressured Britain and America to open up a second front in Western Europe. Stalin argued that an invasion across the English Channel would force Hitler to divert troops from the Soviet front back to the westward, the westward side. Churchill and Roosevelt didn't think the Allies actually had enough troops to launch a successful invasion of Europe. Instead, they launched what was called Operation Torch, an invasion of Axis-controlled North Africa, then commanded by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is sometimes considered one of the forgotten venues of World War II, that there was fighting in North Africa, but there sure was. Subpoint E. Even before that battle in North Africa was won, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their commanders met in Casablanca. There at the city, there was a meeting. Two leaders agreed to accept only the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. That is, the enemy nations would have to accept whatever terms of peace the Allies dictated, and the Nazis wouldn't be in a position to go argue for otherwise. The two leaders discussed where to go strike next. The Americans argued that the best place to approach a victory was to assemble a massive invasion fleet in Great Britain and then launch it across the English Channel through France and into the heart of Germany. Churchill, though, thought, we've got all of our troops here in North Africa, let's invade through Italy and march up the peninsula from there. The Italian campaign got off to a good start with the capture of Sicily in the summer of 1943. And really, stunned by how fast the army collapsed in Sicily, the Italian government looked at Benito Mussolini and said, hey, you're supposed to organize for successes. And in this case, we're kind of tired of your stuff, and your army's just collapsed right away. And they forced Mussolini to go resign. On July 25th of 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III summoned Il Duce, which is Italian for the leader, and it refers to Mussolini. They summoned Il Duce to his palace. There, he stripped him of power, had him arrested, and said, at this moment, you are the most hated man in all of Italy. Italians began celebrating what looked like to them at least the end of the war. Their cheers, though, were premature. Hitler was determined to stop the Allies there in Italy rather than letting the fight reach German soil. And one of the hardest battles the Allies would encounter in all of Europe was in Italy along the way. And there they fought in the city of Anzio, 40 miles from Rome. And there, the Battle of Anzio lasted 4 months, basically until the end of May of 1944, and it left around 25,000 Allied and 30,000 Axis casualties. During the year after the Battle of Anzio, German armies continued to put up strong resistance, and the effort to free Italy came late. It didn't actually succeed until 1945, when Germany itself was close to collapse. But it turns out that the fighting in Italy, while the Allied troops were able to move up the peninsula, it was a hard-fought win to get there. Subpoint F. Among the brave men who fought in Italy were the pilots, big difference. Among the brave men who fought in Italy were the pilots of the all-black 99th Pursuit Squadron, known as the Tuskegee Airmen. In Sicily, the Tuskegee Airmen Squadron registered its first victory against enemy aircraft and went on to more impressive strategic strikes against German forces really throughout the country of Italy. The Tuskegee Airmen won 2 Distinguished Unit Citations, which is the military's highest commendation for a unit, for their outstanding aerial combat against the German Luftwaffe. Another African-American unit distinguished itself was the famous 92nd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Buffaloes. In just 6 months after fighting in Europe, the Buffaloes won 7 Legion of Merit Awards, 65 Silver Stars, and 162 Bronze Stars for courage under fire. Japanese Americans oftentimes don't get the credit they have for serving for American sides during World War II. There they served in Italy and North Africa, and at the urging of General Dallas Emmons, the Army created the 100th Battalion, consisting of 1,300 Hawaiian Nisei. The word Nisei is basically refers to American citizens whose parents had immigrated from Japan. And that 100th unit, the 100th Battalion, saw brutal combat and actually became known as the Purple Heart Battalion because they suffered so many injuries. Later, the 100th was merged into the All-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which would go on to be the most decorated unit in U.S. history. Roman numeral number 12. Here I want to talk about how Europe was free from the Axis control in subpoint A of D-Day. Even as the Allies were battling in Italy of 1943, they'd begun work on a dramatic plan to invade France and free Western Europe from the Nazis. The task of commanding Operation Overlord, as it was officially called, came to the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike, who was the head of the American forces in North Africa. Under Eisenhower's direction in England, the Allies had gathered a force of nearly 3 million British, American, Canadian troops, and together with mountains of military equipment and supplies, Eisenhower planned to attack Normandy in northern France. But to keep their plans secret, the Allies also set up a huge phantom army with its own headquarters and its own equipment. And in secret radio messages that they knew the Germans were reading and translating, the Allied commanders sent orders to make this make-believe army to go attack the French port of Calais. Calais was 150 miles away, where the English Channel is the narrowest, and honestly, it was a much more logical place to invade. But as a result, Hitler ordered his generals to keep a large army at Calais, walking into the, well, not the trap, but certainly taking the bait that the Allies were laying for him. Operation Overlord was originally set for June 5th, but bad weather forced a delay. Banking on a forecast for clearing skies, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead for D-Day. The D-Day had been moved then to July 6th of 1944, which was the first day of the invasion. And shortly after midnight, 3 divisions parachuted down behind German lines. There they were followed in the early morning hours by thousands upon thousands of seaborne soldiers, the largest land, sea, air operation in Army history. Despite the massive air and sea bombardment by the Allies, the German retaliation was brutal, particularly that of Omaha Beach. D-Day is considered like one of the most masterful invasion and military tactics, but the D doesn't actually stand for anything. It was just a day, D-Day. Subpoint B. Despite the heavy casualties, the Allies actually held the beachheads. After 7 days of fighting, the Allies eventually ended up taking an 80-mile stretch along the beaches of France. Within 7 days of 80-mile strip. Within a month, they'd landed 1 million troops, a little over 500,000 tons of supplies, and 170,000 vehicles in France. On July 25th, General Omar Bradley unleashed a massive air and land bombardment against the enemy at St. Lo, which provided a gap in the German line of defense, through which General George Patton and his Third Army could advance. On August 23rd, Patton and the Third Army reached the Seine River south of Paris. 2 days later, French resistance forces and American troops liberated the French capital from 4 years of being occupied by the Germans. By September of 1944, the Allies had freed France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And this good news, and the American people's desire not to change horses in midstream, helped elect Franklin Roosevelt to an unprecedented 4th term in November, along with his running mate, the Missouri Senator Harry Truman. Subpoint C. On October of 1944, Americans captured their first German town, the town of Aachen. Hitler responded with a desperate last-grasp offensive. He ordered his troops to break through the Allied lines and to recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp. From this bold move, the Führer hoped they would disrupt the enemy's supply line and demoralize the Allies. On December 6th, under the cover of dense fog, 8 German tank divisions broke through weak American forces and then opened up an 80-mile front in the war. Hitler hoped that the victory would split American and British forces and break up the Allied supply lines. Tanks drove 60 miles into Allied territory, creating a bulge in the lines that gave this last-ditch battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. As Germans swept westward, they captured 120 American GIs near Malmedy. Elite German troops, known as the SS troopers, herded the prisons into a large field and mowed them down with machine guns and pistols. The Battle of the Bulge raged for about a month, and when it was over, the Germans had been pushed back, and it seems like very little had changed, even for all of the lives that had been lost. But in fact, the things had taken a decisive turn. The Germans lost 120,000 soldiers, 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,600 planes in that Battle of the Bulge. More soldiers and weapons than they could really replace. And from that point on, the Nazis could do very little but retreat. And that takes us to subpoint D. Meanwhile, Allied troops pressed eastward into the German heartland, and the Soviet army pushed westward across Poland towards Berlin. The Soviet troops were the first ones to find the death camps, the Nazi death camps, in July of 1944. As the Soviets drew near a camp called Majdanek in Poland, SS guards worked feverishly to bury and burn all of the evidence of their hideous crimes. But they ran out of time. When the Soviets entered Majdanek, they found 1,000 starving prisoners clinging to the edges of life. They found the world's largest crematorium and a storehouse containing 800,000 shoes. Americans who later liberated the Nazi death camps in Germany were equally horrified. Subpoint E. In February of 1945, the Allies pushed towards victory in Europe, and an ailing Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin in the Black Sea resort city of Yalta. Yalta's in the Soviet Union, and there Stalin graciously welcomed the president and his prime minister, the Big Three as they were called, and they toasted the defeat of Germany because it now seemed like it was certain. For 8 grilling days, these three leaders discussed the fate of Germany and truly the post-war world. Stalin, his country devastated by German forces, favored a harsh approach. He wanted to keep Germany divided into occupation zones, areas controlled by Allied military forces, so that Germany would never again threaten the Soviet Union. Churchill strongly disagreed, and Roosevelt kind of stood between them as a mediator. Roosevelt was prepared to make certain concessions to Stalin's for a couple of reasons. First, he hoped the Soviet Union would stand by its commitments to join the war against Japan that was still waging in the Pacific. The first test of the atom bomb was still 5 months away, and there was a lot of fighting left to be done. Second, Roosevelt wanted Stalin's support for a new world peacekeeping organization to be named the United Nations. The historic meeting at Yalta produced a series of compromises. To pacify Stalin, Roosevelt convinced Churchill to agree to a temporary division of Germany into 4 different zones, one each for the Americans, the British, the Soviets, and the French. Churchill and Roosevelt assumed that in time all the zones would be brought together for a reunited Germany. For his part, Stalin also made certain concessions, promising free and unfettered elections in Poland and in other Soviet-occupied Eastern European countries. Stalin also agreed to join that war in Japan. The struggle was expected to continue for at least another year, and in addition, he also agreed to participate in an international conference to take place in April in San Francisco. There, Roosevelt's dream of a United Nations could become a reality. Subpoint F. By April 25th, 1945, the Soviet army had stormed into Berlin. As Soviet shells burst overhead, the city absolutely panicked. In his underground headquarters in Berlin, Hitler prepared for the end. On April 29th, he married Eva Braun, his longtime girlfriend. That same day, he wrote out his last address to the German people. In it, he blamed the Jews for starting the war and blamed his generals for losing it. He writes, "I die with a happy heart, aware of the immeasurable deeds of our soldiers at the front. I myself and my wife choose to die in order to escape the disgrace of capitulation," he said. The next day, Hitler shot himself and his new wife swallowed poison. In accordance with Hitler's orders, the 2 bodies were carried outside, soaked with gasoline, and burned. A week later, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. On May 8th of 1945, the Allies celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was finally over. Subpoint G. President Roosevelt, he didn't live to see VE Day. On April 12th of 1945, while posing for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia, the president, who was ailing, had a stroke and died. That night, April 12th of 1945, President Harry S. Truman became the nation's 33rd president. This change in leadership in the midst of a war would have a massive carryovers that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.